The auction was almost over
my
when the worst horse
God.
anyone had ever seen came through the gate, and every single person who was watching knew that this moment would either be funny or sad, and they could not figure out which one it was going to be. Marcus stood at the back of the crowd with his hands in his pockets and his eyes fixed on something that made the other buyers actually step away and shake their heads. The horse was the color of old dirt, not pretty dirt, bad dirt. The kind of dirt that sits in the corner of a garage and nobody cleans it up because nobody wants to look at it anymore. The horse's ribs stuck out so far that you could count each one from where Marcus was standing, 15 feet away. The animal's back leg was wrapped in something that looked like it had been wrapped by someone who had never wrapped anything before in their life. The wrap was falling apart. Pieces of dirty cloth hung down toward the ground. The horse stood with most of his weight on 3 legs, like he was too tired to stand on all 4. One of his ears was bent at a strange angle. It was not a natural angle. Ears were not supposed to fold that way. The horse's eye was cloudy on one side, like he was looking at the world through a broken window. The auctioneer was a man named Buck who had been selling horses for 30 years, and he sounded tired and annoyed when he spoke into his microphone. "Okay, people, we have got a registered Mustang cross here, about 8, maybe 9 years old. Says here he is sound mostly. Previous owner indicates behavioral issues, so we are looking at a horse that needs some work. That is no secret. We are going to start the bidding at $50. Do I hear 50? Anybody? $50 to start?" Nobody moved. Nobody raised their hand. There was a moment of complete silence, except for the sound of the wind moving through the metal fences of the auction yard. The silence felt heavy. It felt like the moment right before something sad happens, and nobody wants to say the sad thing out loud. Buck tried again. His voice got a little bit smaller. "Okay, what about $40? Anybody want this horse for $40? Still nothing. The horse stood there and trembled slightly, like he could feel the judgment in the air. Maybe he could. Maybe animals knew when people had already decided they did not want them. 25? Buck said, and now his voice sounded almost like he was begging. Do I hear $25 for this horse? 25? Marcus watched the horse's eye. The good eye, the clear one. That eye was looking at something far away, something nobody else in the auction yard could see. That eye had the look of something that had given up. Marcus knew that look. He saw it in the mirror. Sometimes Buck sighed and looked at his clipboard. All right, we are going to go lower. Do I have $20? Anybody? $20? And that was when Marcus raised his hand. His hand went up slow and calm, like he was not sure if he was really doing this, or if his arm was just lifting on its own. The auctioneer's eyebrows went up so high, they almost disappeared under his hat. Buck looked at Marcus, like Marcus had just said something in a language that nobody spoke anymore. I got 20. Did I get 20? I got 20. Sold to the gentleman in the back. $20. Congratulations. It happened in maybe 5 seconds total. The whole thing. The most expensive decision Marcus had ever made took 5 seconds. And when it was done, he was the owner of a horse that nobody else in the world had wanted. And he had paid the smallest amount of money possible for that horse. And now he had to walk up to the payment window and hand over actual cash that he did not have to spare. The woman at the payment window did not even look at him. She just held out her hand and asked, "Cash or card?" "Cash," Marcus said. He pulled out a worn envelope from inside his jacket. His hands were shaking. He did not know why they were shaking. He had made bigger mistakes than this. He had made much bigger mistakes. But something about handing over $20 for this particular horse felt like the biggest and smallest decision of his entire life at the same time. When they led the horse out to the payment area, Marcus got his first look at the full damage. The wrap on the back leg was worse than it looked from far away. It was so tight that the horse's hoof below the wrap was swollen and purple. The horse walked with a limp so bad that every fourth step looked like pure pain. The horse's whole backside was muscle locked up tight. The horse was shaking. Not the gentle kind of shaking that comes from cold. The kind of shaking that comes from terror. A man who worked at the auction, a younger guy named David, handed Marcus the lead rope. David looked embarrassed for Marcus. "You sure about this one?" David asked. "He has bit 2 people. Tried to rear up on the last handler." Marcus looked at the horse. The horse was looking away, looking at nothing, looking like he had already decided that whatever happened next did not matter, because nothing good was going to happen anyway. "Yeah," Marcus said. "I am sure." The drive to Jim's property took 40 minutes, and for all 40 minutes, Marcus could hear the horse moving in the trailer behind him. The horse was nervous. The horse was trying to figure out if this was going to be the moment that everything got worse. Marcus understood that. Marcus had spent the last 18 months figuring out if this was the moment that everything got worse. At some point, after enough things had gotten worse, you stopped being surprised by it. When he backed the trailer up to the small paddock that Jim had offered to let him use for free, the sun was going down. The mountains were turning purple and gold. The wind was cold. It smelled like pine trees and the end of the day. Marcus opened the back of the trailer, and the horse did not move. So Marcus walked in slowly and stayed very quiet and waited. He had learned a long time ago that sometimes the thing you have to do is just stand there and not make any sudden movements and let the scared thing decide that you are not going to hurt it. After maybe 5 minutes, the horse walked forward. He limped out of the trailer slowly and stepped onto the ground of the paddock that was now his home. He looked around at the mountains and the shelter and the water trough. He looked at Marcus. Marcus stood very still and looked back. In that moment, with the sun going down and the mountains turning dark and 2 broken things standing in front of each other in the middle of nowhere. Neither one of them knew that they had just met the person or animal that was going to save their entire life. They only knew that they were both alone, and now they were alone together. And sometimes that is where every story that matters has to start. This version opens with maximum unexpected attention by starting with the moment of rejection and shock, putting you immediately in the emotional scene, using simple English throughout, and building the tension and mystery that makes audiences want to see what happens next. Marcus did not sleep that night. He sat in his truck in the driveway of Jim's property with the engine running just enough to keep the heat on, and he watched the shelter where the horse was standing in the darkness. The horse had not moved much since Marcus had left him there with water and a small pile of hay. The animal just stood in the corner like he was trying to make himself smaller, like maybe if he was small enough, nobody would notice him, and he could just disappear. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Marcus turned off the truck and walked out to the shelter. The cold hit him like a wall. It was the kind of cold that made your breath visible, and your hands hurt within seconds. The horse's ears perked up when Marcus came close, but he did not run. He did not rear up. He just stood there with his weight on 3 legs and waited to see what was going to happen. Marcus stood about 10 feet away. He did not get closer. He had learned a long time ago that when something is scared, you do not force yourself on it. You just wait. You just exist in the same space, and you make yourself boring and harmless until the scared thing decides that maybe you are not a threat. "I do not know what your name is," Marcus said out loud. His voice sounded strange in the darkness. It sounded like a voice that had not talked to anything in a long time. "I do not know what happened to you, but we are stuck with each other now, so we might as well make the best of it." The horse's ears turned toward Marcus's voice. That was something. That was not much, but it was something.
Marcus stood there in the cold for another 30 minutes. The horse did not move. Marcus did not move. 2 broken things in the darkness just being alive together, just waiting for morning to come. When the sun came up the next day, Marcus could see the damage in the light, and it was worse than he had thought. The wrap on the horse's back leg was so infected that even from a distance you could smell something bad coming from it. The wrap was yellow and brown with old blood and old pus. The horse's hoof below the wrap was swollen to almost twice the size of normal. The leg itself was so swollen that it looked like it did not belong to the same animal. The horse could barely stand on it. When he tried to put weight on that leg, his whole body shook and his ears pinned back flat, like he was bracing for pain. Marcus called his sister Sarah. Sarah was the only family he had left that still took his calls. She was 5 years younger than him, and she had escaped the mountain life and moved to the city and become a person with a real job and a real life and a real future. She had tried for years to get Marcus to leave too, to leave the horses and the small towns and the failed dreams. But Marcus had never been able to leave. Horses were the only thing he understood. "Marcus, where are you calling from?" Sarah said when she picked up. She sounded worried already, and he had not even told her anything yet. "I am at Jim's property," Marcus said. "I bought a horse yesterday." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "You what?" Sarah said finally. "Marcus, you do not even have money for yourself. How do you have money for a horse?" "It was $20, Marcus said. $20? Sarah said. "Why would you buy a horse for $20? What is wrong with it?" "Everything," Marcus said. "Everything is wrong with it." He told her about the auction. He told her about the horse that nobody wanted. He told her about the wrapped leg and the broken ear, and the eye that looked like it had seen things no animal should see. He told her about the decision that had taken 5 seconds, and the money that he did not have to spend. Sarah made a sound that was almost a laugh, but not quite. It was the sound of someone who loves you, but thinks you are completely insane. "Marcus, you cannot even take care of yourself," she said. "How are you going to take care of a horse?" "I do not know," Marcus said honestly, "but I am going to try." "Do you even have money for a vet?" Sarah asked. "That leg sounds like it needs a vet." Marcus did not answer because the answer was no. The answer was, he had no money for a vet and no way to get money for a vet, and the horse's leg was probably going to get worse instead of better, and he had just made the biggest mistake of a life that was already full of big mistakes. But Sarah was his sister, and she loved him, even though she did not understand him. So she did something that made Marcus start crying right there in the cold morning with the horse watching him. She told him to call her back in an hour. When he called back an hour later, she had already contacted a veterinary school. She had explained the situation to someone named Dr. Patterson, who taught at the school. She had told him about Marcus, about the horse, about the broken leg and the infection.
It could be a question of whether this animal could be saved.
Stuck in the horse's throat. Marcus
Frank
still
had
had to
seen
pay
all
something,
of these things,
but not the full
before
price.
and knew how to handle
Sarah
them.
had offered
But
to
as
pay
he looked
half,
at Monarch more
and Marcus
carefully,
would have to
he
pay
noticed
the other
something
half
strange.
in whatever
The
work
horse
he could
was
do
not
in
just
the coming
panicking
weeks.
from pain.
When the vet
Monarch
team
was staring
arrived
at
the next
something.
afternoon,
His neck was
there were
stretched
three
toward the
people,
corner of
Dr.
the barn,
Patterson and
who
his
was
entire
older
body
and
was
had kind
trembling
eyes,
violently.
and 2 students
His
who looked
eyes were
nervous
locked on
about
something
being
that
there.
Frank could
Dr.
not
Patterson
see.
did not
Frank
waste
turned his
time with
flashlight
questions.
toward that corner.
He just went straight to
He
the
saw
horse
nothing
and
but
examined the
darkness
leg
and the
carefully.
familiar
What
clutter
he
that
said
had
next was the
accumulated
thing
in
that
that
changed
space
everything.
over the years. The horse
An
is
old
lucky,
saddle leaning
Dr.
against the
Patterson
wall.
said. Stacks
Another
of hay
week of
bales,
this,
and the
a broken
infection
water
would have
pump
gone
that
into
had been
the bone.
sitting there for
Another
at least
month,
6
and
months.
we would be looking at
a wooden
permanent
crate that
lameness,
looked like it
maybe
had been there
amputation.
forever.
But right
Frank
now,
reached out to
now
touch
we can still
Monarch's
save
neck,
this leg.
trying to calm him
Marcus
the way
felt
he
something
always
break
did when
open
a horse
inside
was
his
nervous.
chest. But the
moment
moment
he
his
had not
hand
allowed
made
himself to
contact
have
with the horse's
a
skin,
possibility he
Monarch
thought
was
screamed
already
again.
dead.
The
Dr.
sound was
Patterson
so
gave the
terrible
horse
and so
antibiotics.
filled with pure
He showed
terror
Marcus
that
how to
Frank
clean the
stepped
wound
back away
properly.
from the stall.
He showed him how
Frank
to wrap
stood
it
there
tight,
in the freezing
but not
barn,
too tight.
watching
He
this
told him
horse
to
that
soak
he
it in
believed
salt
he knew
water twice
better
a
than
day
any
and keep
creature
it
on
clean
earth.
and dry,
and he felt
the horse
something
had a
shift
real
inside him.
chance. He did not
But you have to
understand
be
what was
consistent.
happening. Dr.
All his
Patterson
experience,
said, looking
all his
directly
knowledge,
at Marcus,
all his certainty
every day
about horses
no shortcuts,
meant nothing in
no
this
days
moment.
off. He
You
was
have to show
completely
up for this
lost.
horse like
Frank
his life
sat on an
depends
old
on it,
wooden bucket
because it
near
does.
Monarch's stall
Marcus
and
nodded.
waited for the
He
sun to
understood.
come up. He had
He did
spent
not leave the
54
barn.
years
He
learning
could
what
not
it meant
leave.
to show up.
Some part of
even
him,
when you did
the
not
part that
want
was
to.
not yet ready
Even when
to
you did
accept
not
that he
have
did
the
not
resources,
understand horses
even
the
when
way
it
he
seemed
thought he
impossible.
did.
Kept
He
him
could do
there
that.
in the freezing
He could
cold.
show up.
Watching
Over the next
and
week,
listening,
Marcus
trying to
did
make
something
sense
that
of something
surprised
that
him.
made no
He
sense
started
at
to
all.
enjoy it.
The screaming
He would wake
stopped
up
around
early,
4 o'clock
drive
in
to
the
Jim's
morning.
property.
Frank hadn't
and
spent
watch.
2 hours with
But he
the
could
horse.
tell by the way the
He would
wind
soak
was
the leg.
changing
He
and
would
the
brush
way
the
the
coat.
darkness
He
seemed
would
to be
stand
loosening
quietly
its grip
and just
a
exist
little
near
bit.
the animal
The
while it
silence
ate
that
hay.
followed the
And the
screaming
horse
was
started to
almost
change,
worse than the
not
noise
fast,
itself.
Not dramatically, when Monarch, but in small ways that only Marcus felt like he was because he was something real and urgent. The horse started to recognize made him feel like he was missing something important. His ears would come forward, something that the horse was still trying to tell him. Instead of Monarch did not calm down. By the 10th day, the horse let Marcus touch his neck back without pulling away. Back and forth. By the 15th day, his hooves making the horse nickered softly when Marcus arrived. Every few minutes, by the 20th day, he would stop and stare at that same horse's eyes. His ears would prick forward. The pain was still there, go tense. But underneath, as if he was listening to something that Frank looked like the beginning of trust. Then he would shake his head, and Marcus realized something that made him understand why screaming by the time the $20 on a horse that everybody else started creeping across. He realized that this horse was not the one. His legs had gone numb from sitting on the bucket. It happened on a Tuesday morning. His back felt like it had turned to concrete, and it was the moment that changed everything in a way he suddenly felt every single one of those years. Marcus had been coming to Jim's property every single day. He forced himself to stand up, holding on to the wooden beam of the barn, not when he was sick, while his legs was working a double shift at the feed store. The morning was coming slow, not when his sister called and told him that their mother was ground outside glittered like he had gone to see his mother for 2 hours. Sat with her while she breath inside and then driven right back to Jim's property to take care of the horse. But he was not thinking about the cold anymore. The horse's leg was healing. He was thinking about the infection was gone, and he was thinking about all the ways he might have. The horse was putting weight on the leg now. Frank approached the horse carefully every single day. The way he would approach an animal was happening too. Something that Marcus had not planned for, and he was still covered in sweat despite the horse was becoming attached to him. Frank started his examination the way he had been trained for an animal. The way the horse had started to actually love him for. When Marcus ran his hands down each of the horse would whinny loudly, checking across the property for swelling, and come running for any sign of injury that would cause this kind of panic. When Marcus sat down to eat lunch, the legs were cool. The horse would put his head on Marcus's shoulder. The hooves looked healthy and clean. When Marcus stood at the fence, there were no cuts or scrapes or signs of infection anywhere that Frank could find. Just being there. He moved to the horse's sides. Marcus would stand there with the horse's head resting on his shoulder, and he would think about how he had paid one of the most serious problems that the whole world had decided was worthless. He found nothing wrong. And that worthless thing Frank had pulled out his veterinary kit from the shelf where he kept it. Made him want to cry. He had learned long ago that a good rancher needed it made him want to do basic medical supplies close at hand. On this Tuesday morning in December, far from any Marcus was soaking the horse's leg in warm water with salt. He took Monarch's temperature by placing the thermometer in the horse's mouth and let Marcus work. He checked the sun was coming up over the mountains, feeling the pulse, painting everything gold and pink, maybe slightly elevated. It was beautiful in a way that made Marcus's animal had been in panic for hours. It was beautiful in a way that reminded him that he was still alive. The pupils looked normal. Some days he forgot the horse's breathing. That was when the truck still rapid was not Jim's truck. By every objective measure that Frank could use, a truck that was a healthy animal. Marcus did not recognize it. The horse was hand on the horse's leg, something was clearly very what was going to happen. In his experience, and looked at the stall carefully. Visitors usually examined something bad was about to happen. Both were clean. The man who got out of the truck, nothing unusual, maybe 60 years old. He looked at the straw. He was wearing expensive clothes, checking for anything that he was wearing the kind of face that Marcus recognized. He looked at the walls, the face of a man who searching for any sign of damage or leaks that might have let something get into the stall. The man walked right up to Marcus without saying hello. That was when Frank noticed something he had completely overlooked. It was not a question for. Yes, in his panic and his shock at Monarch's behavior, he did not look up from the horse's leg. He had not really looked at where the horse was staring. The man continued. The horse's eyes were fixed on the corner of the barn. That horse came from my ranch. Was sitting. I bred him myself. Was old and weathered. His name was Storm. With boards that Marcus's hands stopped moving over the years. He looked up slowly. Frank had never really paid much attention to it. Storm. It had been on the property when he bought the place. His face was hard and years ago. I paid good money for the previous owner along. His mother was one of the best Mustangs I ever owned and junk. I had big plans for him. Frank walked over to the crates and looked at it more closely. I was going to train him and sell him for a light of dawn. It was larger than he remembered. Animal, maybe 4 feet long. Marcus did not say anything. 3 feet tall. He waited. The wood was so difficult and weathered that it was hard to tell what it was originally made of. Harder. There were dark stains on one corner. He would not cooperate. Stains that you get when something has been sitting in one place for a very long time. And he just kept refusing. So I got frustrated. I sold him to someone else. Thought maybe someone else could do better. That was 5 years ago. The man looked at the horse now, really looked at him, and for a second, something soft came into his face, something that looked like regret. What happened to him? The man asked quietly. Marcus told him. He told him about the auction. It could be that something was stuck in the horse's throat. He told him about the broken leg all of these infection in the eye that did not handle clearly. But as he told him about the 43 days of showing up something strange, soaking the leg, the horse was not just panicking from pain and waiting for the horse to decide that Marcus was. His neck was stretched toward the corner without interrupting, and his entire body was trembling. The man just stood there looking. His eyes were locked on something that Frank could not see. The man said finally. Frank turned his flashlight toward that corner. He saw nothing but darkness and the familiar clutter that had accumulated in that space. Because he survived when most animals would not have. An old saddle leaning against the wall. Because he is lucky that he is still alive. Stacks of hay bales. The man nodded slowly. A broken water pump that had been sitting there for at least 6 months. Better than a wooden crate that looked like it had been there forever. Then the man reached out to touch Marcus did not expect, trying to calm him the way he always did when a horse was nervous. He touched the ear that his hand made contact and the eye that was cloudy and the soft spot between the horse's eyes. The sound was so terrible and so filled with pure terror that Frank stepped back away from the stall. I am sorry I gave up on freezing barn. The horse did not pull this horse that he believed he knew better than any creature on earth. The horse just stood there and felt something let the man touch him. He did not understand what was happening. In some way that Marcus could not understand. All his knowledge. The man turned to leave about horses, but before he did, nothing in this he said something else. He was completely lost. You are a good man. Frank sat on an old wooden bucket near Monarch's stall and waited for the sun to come up. I can see it in the way the horse looks at you. He did not leave the barn. I gave up on that animal because I thought he was broken beyond fixing. The part that was not yet ready to accept that he did someone who was not going to break him the way he thought he did. You gave him that, kept him there in the freezing cold. Then the man got in his truck, listening, and drove away. And trying to make sense of something in the cold morning with his hand on the horse's leg. The screaming stopped around 4 o'clock in the second chances. Frank had no watch. He thought about how people could tell by the way the wind was changing and the way the darkness never know that someone else came along just loved them back into wholeness. The silence that followed the screaming was almost worse than the noise who had given up on this horse. At least when Monarch never know what Lucky became. Frank felt like he was witnessing something real and the horse turned his head. The silence made him feel like he was missing something. I was still cloudy, something that the horse was still trying to tell him. It was full of Monarch did not calm down completely, full of life. The horse paced in his stall. Marcus understood something that changed how he thought about everything. Dull thuds. This horse was not healed because of Marcus's knowledge. He would stop and stare at that same corner again because Marcus' ears would prick forward. Not because Marcus was a great trainer or a brilliant horseman, as if he was listening to something because Marcus had shown up every single day. Then he would shake his head and go back to his broken life. Frank's joints were screaming by the time the first hints of gray light started creeping across the eastern horizon. That night, his legs had gone numb from sitting on the bucket, but this time it was not because he was worried. His back felt like it was because he was thinking about something that the man had said. Something about how you could see every single one of the way a horse looked at someone. Plus about 20 more. Something about how that forced himself was the realest form of holding onto the wooden beam of the barn. Marcus went out to the shelter at midnight while his legs remembered how to work again. Standing up. The morning was coming slow and cold. Marcus put his hand on the horse's neck outside, the glittered like broken diamonds in the early light. Felt the life that was still here because he had decided to show up. The air was that cold. He whispered something to the horse that he had not said out loud to anything. He was thinking about Monarch. He was thinking about all the ways he might have missed something. And somewhere in the darkness, Frank approached the horse carefully. A horse that had been the way he would approach an animal man that the world had forgotten. Monarch's eyes were still wide, and he was still covered in sweat. They were just two things that had found each other. Frank started his examination the way he had been trained to do. Everything the way he had done started like any other morning. He ran his hands down each of the horse's legs. Marcus woke up in his truck at 5 o'clock in the morning like he always did. For any sign of injury that would cause this kind of panic. He had been sleeping in his truck. There was more and more these days. The legs were cool, even though he had a rental room. The hooves looked healthy, and the room cost $400 a month. Scrapes, and that was $400 he did anywhere that Frank could find. His job at the feed store had cut his hours down to 20 a week because winter was coming. Tightness that would indicate how much feed. One of the most serious 20 hours a week at $9 an hour. Again, he was making about $180. Frank pulled out his veterinary kit. That was not enough for rent and food and gas. He had learned long ago that a good rancher needed to have basic Marcus sat in the truck close and could not make his body out here, far from any vet. You had to be able to handle emergencies yourself. He took Monarch's temperature by placing the thermometer in the horse's mouth. Normal. He checked the horse's heart rate by feeling the pulse in the horse's neck. Maybe slightly elevated, but that was expected if the animal had been in panic for hours. Frank looked at Monarch's eyes more carefully. The pupils looked normal. The horse's breathing, while still rapid, was not struggling. By every objective measure that Frank could use, Monarch was a healthy animal. The horse was not sick. The horse was not injured. Yet something was clearly very, very wrong. Frank stepped back and looked at the stall carefully. He examined the food and water. Both were clean and fresh, nothing unusual there. He looked at the straw bedding, checking for anything that might have scared the horse. Nothing. He looked at the walls and the roof, searching for any sign of damage or leaks that might have let something get into the stall. Everything seemed perfectly normal. That was when Frank noticed something he had completely overlooked the night before. In his panic and his shock at Monarch's behavior, he had not really looked at where the horse was staring. The horse's eyes were fixed on the corner of the barn where a wooden crate was sitting. The crate was old and weathered, with boards that had cracked and split over the years. Frank had never really paid much attention to it. It had been on the property when he bought the place 12 years ago, left behind by the previous owner along with various other pieces of equipment and junk. Frank walked over to the crate and looked at it more closely in the growing light of dawn. It was larger than he remembered, maybe 4 feet long and 3 feet tall. The wood was so old and weathered that it was hard to tell what it was originally made of. There were dark stains on one corner, the kind of stains that you get when something has been sitting in one place for a very long time. It was the kind of mourning that happens to people who have stopped believing that something was stuck and is going to get better. It was the kind of morning where you wake up and realize that you have been fighting for so long that you cannot remember what you were fighting something strange. It was the kind of morning where you panic about just staying in the truck was staring at getting out. His neck was stretched toward the corner of the barn where someone and his entire body was trembling. But then Lucky nickered. His eyes were locked on the direction of the shelter. Could not see. A soft, Frank turned his flashlight toward that Lucky corner. Was asking where Marcus was. He saw nothing but darkness. Lucky was wondering if the familiar clutter that had Lucky was waiting for him the way he waited every single morning. An old saddle leaning against the wall with trust, stacks of hay bales, with the kind of faith that a broken water pump when they have that been sitting there for one human being's months is their whole world. A wooden crate Marcus got out of the truck. Been there forever. His legs were stiff. Frank reached out to touch Monarch's neck, trying to calm him the way he always did from the arthritis that got worse every year. But the moment his hand made contact in a way that did not have a name, Monarch screamed again. But he moved toward the shelter anyway because that is what you do when another living thing that Frank stepped back away from the stall. Frank stood there in the freezing barn, watching this horse that he believed put his head on Marcus's chest any creature the way he did every morning. He felt something shift inside. The horse's breathing, he did not understand what was happening. The horse's heartbeat was strong and sure. All his knowledge. The horse was alive because Marcus had kept him alive. Nothing in this moment. And Marcus was alive because the horse had given him Frank a reason sat on an old wooden bucket near Monarch's stall together in the freezing cold for the sun to come early December. He did not leave Marcus made a decision that changed everything. Some part of him. He decided to keep the horse no matter ready to accept not because it made sense. Not understand horses not because he had the money. Not because he had in the freezing cold. He decided it, watching sometimes in life, and trying to make a point where you stop making decisions based on what is smart. The screaming stopped around you start making decisions based on what is true. Frank had no watch, and the true thing could tell by the way this horse was worth more to Marcus and the way the darkness seemed to be loosening. The true thing was that losing Lucky would be worse than dying. The silence that followed the screaming was almost something happened that Marcus did not expect. At least when a man came walking across the property, Frank felt like he was witnessing something real and urgent. The man was older. The silence made him feel like he was missing something with a weathered face and the kind of body that came from a lifetime of physical Monarch did not. He was wearing a worn hat and clothes that had been expensive maybe 10 years ago, but were comfortable now. He walked like he owned dull thuds against but not in a mean way. Every few minutes, like he would stop and stare at that same corner. The man stopped at the fence. His ears would just watch for a long time, and his body would go tense. Marcus felt he was listening to something that Frank he had learned to be suspicious of. Then he would shake his head and go back to unexpected visitors. Frank's joints were screaming by the time the unexpected visitors usually started creeping across the That is a nice horse. His legs had gone numb from sitting on the bucket for so many hours. Like the voice of someone who had turned to horses more than people. He was 68 years old. Marcus and he suddenly felt he did not elaborate one of those years. He did not explain the story. About 20 more. He just stated he forced himself to stand back to what he was doing. Holding on to the wooden beam into the pasture for support. The man asked, while his legs remembered how to work again. The man nodded like that answer was what he expected. The frost that covered the ground and outside glittered, and there was something in the way he was watching that made Marcus pay attention. Frank could see his breath. The man was not looking at Lucky's body. The air was that cold, or his build, but he was not thinking about the cold. He was looking at Lucky's eyes. He was thinking about. He was looking at Lucky's expression. He was thinking about all the ways he might have missed something. After maybe 10 minutes, Frank approached the horse carefully. The way he would approach an animal, he did not know. I own the ranch up the mountain, were still wide, 5 miles and he was still covered in sweat. I have been raising and training horses for 43 years. Frank started his examination the way he had been trained to do. The way but I have never seen a broken animal look at a human being. He ran his hands down each of the horse's legs. Marcus did not know what to say to that. For swelling, what is his story? For any sign of injury that would cause this kind of panic. And Marcus did something he never did. There was nothing. He told it. The legs were cool. He told Garrett about the auction. The hooves looked $20 and clean. The wrapped leg. There were no cuts or scrapes. He told him about the 43 days that Frank could find. He told him about the man who came with the brand, feeling carefully for the hardness. He told him everything except the part about how the horse was keeping him alive. One of the most serious problems that could happen to a horse. That part was too true. He found nothing wrong. Garrett listened without interrupting. Frank pulled out his veterinary kit when Marcus was done, where he nodded slowly. He had learned long ago that a good rancher needed to have basic medical supplies. I know that most people think breaking a wild horse is like breaking from any other horse. You had to be able to handle emergencies. A wild horse is not a broken animal. He took Monarch's temperature by placing the thermometer in animal that has never been damaged by human hands. He checked the horse's heart rate. When you introduced that animal to humans, the horse's neck, you were introducing it to something that can either destroy. But that was expected if the animal had been in panic for hours. There is no middle ground. Frank looked at Monarch. Garrett walked to the fence gate, and Marcus let him in because something told him that this man was still rapid. Garrett approached Lucky slowly. By every objective measure that Frank could use, Monarch was a healthy animal. He just stood near the horse and waited. The horse was not injured. Lucky put his head near Garrett's chest. Very wrong. Garrett put one weathered hand and looked at the stall carefully. This horse has already learned to trust one human. Both were clean and fresh. Nothing unusual there. That is precious. He looked at the straw bedding. That is something most horses never learn, that might have scared the horse. Especially wild Mustangs with trauma histories. He looked at the walls and the roof. Then Garrett said something that made Marcus's damage or leaks that might have let something get into the stall. Garrett, everything seemed perfectly normal. That was when Frank noticed something he had completely overlooked the night before. You have proven that in his shock at Monarch's behavior. You have proven that he had not really looked at where the horse was staring. Consistency the horse's eyes were fixed on the corner of the barn thing can heal crate if someone shows up for it. The crate was old and weathered. That is not just a story about a horse and split. That is a story about everything. Frank had never really paid much attention to it. Garrett turned. It had been on the property at Marcus when he bought the place. What you have learned from this animal could help behind by the previous owner along with various other pieces in this world who are broken the way this horse was broken. Frank walked over to the crate. They have been hurt and looked at it more closely. In the growing, they do not believe that anything larger is going to happen to them anymore. Maybe 4 feet long, and what they need is exactly what you gave this horse. The wood was so old. They need someone to weathered that it was hard to tell what it was originally made of. They need someone to love them without needing anything. The kind of stains that you get. Marcus did not understand what Garrett was saying for a very long time. It did not make sense. I have some connections, Garrett said. People who work in therapeutic programs. People who understand trauma. People who are looking for someone who knows how to reach broken things. People who would pay good money for that skill. I do not have any qualifications, Marcus said. I do not have any degrees. It could be college, Garrett said. It could be an infection. You have something better. It could be that something was stuck in the horse's throat. And you had the knowledge that you earned by showing up every single day when it did not make sense to show up. Carefully, that is worth more than something strange. Garrett was not just panicking from pain. He told Marcus about the therapeutic community. His neck was stretched toward the corner of the barn, about using horses to help people heal from trauma and addiction. His eyes were locked on something that he talked about a woman named Dr. Patricia Medina who ran a facility that was looking to expand. He saw nothing but darkness and the familiar clutter that had accumulated in that space. He handed Marcus a check for $2,000 an old saddle leaning against the wall, for feed and care, stacks of hay, and whatever else Lucky needs. A broken water pump that had been sitting there, and consider it a down payment on your future. A wooden crate. When Garrett looked like it had been Marcus there forever. Stood alone in the pasture. Reached out to touch Monarch's neck, and he understood something that he had not understood always before. Did when a horse sometimes was nervous. The thing that saves you is not his hand made contact with the horse's skin. Sometimes the thing that saves you is the sound decision to love something broken, filled with pure and the trust that other people will back away from the stall and will recognize it as the most valuable thing. Watching this horse that he believed he knew better than any place that looked nothing like the auction yard where the story started. He did not understand what was happening. The facility was beautiful in a quiet way. All his knowledge. It was not fancy or expensive horses meant nothing. It was just a working ranch with green pastures and solid barns. Frank sat on an old wooden bucket near Monarch's stall. There were 12 horses on the property. He did not. Marcus knew each one of them intimately. Some knew their fears and their histories, was not yet ready to accept things that made not understand horses the way he knew this because he had trained every single one of them the same way, watching, listening, and trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. The screaming stopped around. Marcus was not sleeping in his truck anymore. Frank had no. He had a house on the property, but he could tell by the way the cottage with 3 rooms and the way the fireplace that actually worked. Loosening its grip. Dr. Patricia Medina had hired him as the head of equine therapy programs at the facility, and he made enough money now to buy Monarch boots, screaming, and eat 3 meals a day. Like he was witnessing something even real money for the future. The silence made him feel like he was missing something seemed impossible 2 years ago, horse was still but it was real now. The future was real. Did not calm down. Today was a special day. The horse paced in his stall. The first official client was arriving. Back a young woman named Sarah, making dull, who was 23 years old and had survived every few minutes terrible. He would stop and stare at that same corner again. Her therapist had recommended the equine program, and his body. Her mother had called and explained that Sarah was afraid to something that Frank could not hear. Sarah did not trust anyone. Shake his head. Sarah had decided that the world. Frank's joints were screaming by the time she would spend the rest of her life protecting herself creeping across the eastern horizon. Dr. Medina had explained sitting on the bucket for so many hours. Marcus had nodded because his back felt like it had turned to concrete. He had spent 18 years becoming that person. He was 68 years old. He had spent 18 years protecting himself by not letting anyone close. Plus about 20 more. And then he had met a horse that needed to stand up. And that needed to the wooden beam something inside him that he thought while his legs remembered how to work again. When Sarah and her mother was coming slow and Marcus was in the main barn. The frost that covered the ground Lucky was older now, glittered almost like broken diamonds in the early light. His leg had healed completely. Frank could see his breath inside the barn now. The air was shining and thick, but he was not thinking about the golden wheat in the sun. He was thinking about his eyes were clear, and he was thinking about all the ways he might have missed something important. The broken ear still Frank approached the horse carefully. But it was the way he would approach an animal. It was just Lucky's particular way of being still wide, and it made him still covered in sweat despite the freezing temperature. Sarah was small. Frank started his examination the way he had been trained to do, the way he had done thousands of times. She moved like she believed she did not deserve to be in the world. He ran his hands down each of the horse's legs. Marcus recognized that checking for heat because he had moved the same way for any sign of injury that would cause. Marcus did not push. He did not try to talk to her. The legs were cool. He just continued brushing Lucky. The hooves looked healthy and let Sarah stand in the barn doorway. There were no cuts or scrapes after maybe 5 minutes. Infection anywhere that Frank could find. After another 5 minutes, to the horse's Sarah stood right next to the carefully for the hardness. Her mother stood behind that would indicate watching. One of the most serious problems that somehow help her daughter come back to the world. He found nothing. This is Lucky. Frank pulled out his veterinary kit from the shelf where he kept it. He just kept brushing. He had learned long ago that a good rancher needed to have basic medical supplies close at hand. He came here broken. Out here, his leg was bad. Any vet. His ear was broken. You had to be able to handle emergencies yourself. But he is okay now. He took Monarch's temperature by placing the thermometer in the every single day. I did not try to change him. The horse's heart rate up by feeling Sarah did not say anything. Horse's neck. Sarah did not maybe move, slightly elevated, but her eyes were on Lucky now. But that was expected if the animal had been in panic for hours. He does not talk. Frank looked at Marcus' eyes more carefully. He just stands here and exists. The horse is sometimes that is enough. While still rapid, sometimes just existing together is by every objective measure that Marcus set down the brush. Monarch was a healthy animal. He did not approach Sarah. The horse was not sick. He did not try to touch her or force her to do anything. Yet something was clearly very. What happened next was so small that someone who was not paying attention might have missed. He examined the food, but Marcus was paying attention. Both were clean and fresh. Marcus was always nothing unusual now because he had learned that the small things were the things that mattered might have scared the horse. Sarah reached out one thin hand. He looked at the walls and touched Lucky's shoulder, searching for any sign of damage. Lucky did not pull back. Might have let something get into the stall. Everything seemed decided the world was too dangerous. That was when Frank noticed something he had completely overlooked. Somehow in that moment, they understood each other in a way that did not need words. He had not Sarah's really mother started where the horse was staring. Over the next 6 months, the horse's eyes were fixed on the corner of the barn 3 times a wooden crate was sitting. She would spend time with Lucky. The crate was old and weathered. She would stand next to him in the pasture. Split over the years. She would rest her head against Frank his neck. Frank had never really paid much attention to it. By week 12, it had been on the Sarah property spoke her first word in place 12 years ago. The word was left behind by the previous owner along with various other pieces of equipment and junk. Frank walked over to the crate and looked at it more closely in the growing light of dawn. It was larger than he remembered, maybe 4 feet long and 3 feet tall. The wood was so old and weathered that it was hard to tell what it was originally made of. There were dark stains on one corner, the kind of stains that you get when something has been sitting in one place for a very long time. By week 18, Sarah was talking almost every day. It could be that something was stuck in the horse's throat. But enough. Frank had to tell her mother that she was starting to believe that maybe the world was not entirely dangerous. But as he looked at Monarch more carefully, maybe there were things in the world that understood pain. The horse was not just panicking from pain. Maybe there were things in the world that could teach you how to heal by stretched toward the corner of the barn, broken, and his entire body was trembling. Other clients came after Sarah. His eyes were locked on something David who had fought in a war and could not Frank turned his flashlight. A teenager named James who had survived a car accident darkness that killed the familiar clutter that had an older woman named Eleanor who had lost her husband, an old saddle leaning against the wall. Continuing to stacks of hay bales. They all came broken water pump that had been sitting there. They all found something in the horses that the therapist a wooden crate had looked like it had been there forever. And Marcus reached out to touch. It was not because the horses were trying to calm him the way he always did. It was because the horses understood what it felt like. But the moment his hand made contact with the horse's skin, the horses understood what it felt like to be afraid. The sound was so terrible to trust and despite filled with pure terror. The horses understood what it felt like to be alone. Frank stood there in another being who would stand watching this horse that he believed he knew better than on a night when the sun was setting, and he felt something shy in colors that did not understand what was happening. Marcus stood all his experience. Lucky was eating hay quietly. All his certainty Marcus was not doing anything meant nothing. He was just existing there. He was the way he had learned to do. Frank sat on an old wooden bucket. Garrett came to the facility once a week and waited for the sun to come up. Helping with training, he did not leave the boss. He could not become something like some part of him. which was a strange thing for Marcus to accept that he did because he had not had a real friend in a very long time. Kept him there in the freezing cold, watching and listening, leaning and trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. Do you remember the day I gave you that check? The screaming stopped around 4 o'clock in the morning. I remember. Frank had no watch. I told you that you had, but he could tell by the way the wind was changing and the way the darkness seemed to be loosening its grip. I was right about that. The silence that followed the screaming was almost worse than the noise itself. The whole truth, at least when Monarch was screaming, is that you did not just help Frank felt like he was witnessing something real. You gave them permission to be broken. The silence made him feel like he was missing something important. That is not a small thing. Something that the horse was still trying to tell him. Marcus did not know what to say. Monarch did not calm down. He was not used to being told that he mattered. The horse paced in his stall, life meant back and forth, that his brokenness had actually become useful. Dull thuds. When you bought that horse for $20, every few minutes, Garrett said, he would stop and stare at that same corner your future. His ears did not know you were buying permission to stop hating yourself. As if he was listening to something that Frank broken things can become whole. Then he would shake his head and go back to loves them long enough. Frank's joints were screaming by the time the first hints of the horse's eyes were clear creeping across the eastern horizon. Something that looked like his legs had gone numb from sitting on the bucket for so many hours. But Marcus had been saved. His back felt like it had turned to concrete. And somewhere in that circle of saving each other, and he suddenly felt every single one of those years that night. Plus about Marcus sat outside his cottage. He forced himself to look at the mountains, holding onto the wooden beam of the barn for support, while his legs remembered how to work again. The same mountains. The morning was coming slow. $20 for a horse. The frost that covered the ground outside. The same mountains glittered like broken diamonds every single day until Frank could see his breath inside the barn. Impossible became the air was that cold. He thought about the boy. He was not thinking about the cold anymore. The young man who had chosen horses over stability. He was thinking about all the ways he might have over the kind of life that made sense. Frank approached the horse carefully. He thought about the way he would approach an animal he did not know. Sleeping in his truck. Monarch's eyes were still minimum wage, and he was still covered in sweat despite the freezing temperature. This moment started his examination the way he had been trained to do, someone whose life mattered, the way he had done someone who had learned that the smallest decision, he ran his hands down each of the horse's legs, the choice to show checking up for something broken, for swelling, could become the foundation of injury that would cause this kind of come after. There was the sun went down, the legs were and the mountains turned purple. The hooves looked healthy. Marcus understood something. There were no cuts or scrapes or signs of infection. The horse anywhere that Frank could find. But he had also saved the horse. He moved to the horse's side, and in saving each other, feeling carefully for the hardness and tightness that was the real story. That was always the real problems that could happen to two broken things that decided to heal together. He found nothing wrong. And in healing together, out his veterinary kit from the shelf that anything was possible. He had learned long ago that a good rancher needed to have for Marcus one more time close at hand. And Marcus stood up far from any vet. The way he had gone to him handle emergency for 2 years. He took Monarch's temperature by placing the thermometer in the horse's mouth. Because that is what love is. He checked the horse's heart rate by feeling the pulse in the horse's neck. It is the decision to keep going slightly elevated. Stopping would be easier. But that was expected if the animal had been in panic for hours. And instead of looking at Monarch's eyes to move closer, the pupils looked normal. I see you. The horse's breathing, while still rapid, and was not struggling. By every objective measure that Frank could use, refusal to abandon was a healthy animal. Everything the horse was not sick. Everything the horse was not injured. Everything was clearly very, very wrong. Frank stepped back and looked at the stall carefully. He examined the food and water. Both were clean and fresh, nothing unusual there. He looked at the straw bedding, checking for anything that might have scared the horse. Nothing. He looked at the walls and the roof, searching for any sign of damage or leaks that might have let something get into the stall. Everything seemed perfectly normal. That was when Frank noticed something he had completely overlooked the night before. In his panic and his shock at Monarch's behavior, he had not really looked at where the horse was staring. The horse's eyes were fixed on the corner of the barn where a wooden crate was sitting. The crate was old and weathered, with boards that had cracked and split over the years. Frank had never really paid much attention to it. It had been on the property when he bought the place 12 years ago, left behind by the previous owner along with various other pieces of equipment and junk. Frank walked over to the crate and looked at it more closely in the growing light of dawn. It was larger than he remembered, maybe 4 feet long and 3 feet tall. The wood was so old and weathered that it was hard to tell what it was originally made of. There were dark stains on one corner, the kind of stains that you get when something has been sitting in one place for a very long time.